What if Napoleon had conquered Russia? June 1812. 600,000 soldiers march into Russia, the largest army ever assembled, led by history's greatest military genius. 6 months later, fewer than 50,000 stagger back across the border, frostbitten, starving, defeated. Napoleon's invasion of Russia destroyed his empire. It shattered the myth of his invincibility, and it proved that even genius has limits. But what if those limits didn't exist? What if Napoleon's Grande Armée captured Moscow and forced Russia to surrender? What if the largest empire on earth fell to French conquest? Europe doesn't just change, the entire world transforms. Because Napoleon victorious in Russia doesn't just dominate his era, he reshapes the next 2 centuries of human history. This is a fictional exploration of how Napoleon's conquest of Russia would cascade through time, altering everything from European borders to world wars to the modern global order. If you want to see how one campaign changes the entire trajectory of civilization, subscribe now. Let's rewrite history. First, we need to understand why the invasion failed. Napoleon's strategy was brilliant on paper. Invade quickly, force a decisive battle, capture Moscow, and compel Tsar Alexander I to negotiate peace. But Russia employed a strategy Napoleon couldn't counter: scorched earth and strategic retreat. Russian armies refused major engagement. They burned crops and villages as they withdrew. Napoleon's army, stretched across hundreds of miles of supply lines, began starving. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September 1812, he found it abandoned and burning. The city couldn't sustain his army. Winter was coming. With no surrender from Alexander and no supplies, Napoleon had no choice but retreat. The retreat became catastrophe. Russian cavalry and Cossacks harassed the column constantly. Winter cold killed thousands daily. Disease ravaged the army. Of 600,000 men who entered Russia, perhaps 40,000 returned combat-ready. This disaster emboldened Napoleon's enemies. Within 2 years, coalition forces invaded France. Napoleon abdicated in 1814, briefly returned in 1815, and was finally defeated at Waterloo. But what if the invasion succeeded? For Napoleon to conquer Russia, several things must go right. Let's construct the most plausible scenario. First, Napoleon invades 1 month earlier, May instead of June. This gives him additional time before winter. Second, Russian commanders make a critical error and accept battle outside Moscow. Perhaps they're pressured by nobles who refuse to see the capital threatened. Napoleon wins a decisive victory. Call it the Battle of Moscow. Russian casualties are catastrophic. The army that remains is incapable of continued resistance. Critically, Napoleon captures key Russian nobles and threatens Moscow's complete destruction. Tsar Alexander I, facing military collapse and aristocratic pressure, negotiates. By November 1812, the Treaty of Moscow is signed. Russia cedes territory, pays enormous indemnities, and joins the continental system, blocking British trade. Napoleon has done what no foreign invader accomplished since the Mongols. He's conquered Russia. With Russia neutralized, the entire European balance of power shifts permanently. Prussia and Austria, who historically joined the coalition against Napoleon after his Russian defeat, now remain subdued. There's no coalition to join. Napoleon controls Europe from Spain to Poland, with Russia forced into alliance. Britain stands alone. Without continental allies, British strategy collapses. They maintain naval supremacy, but can't project land power. The Peninsular War in Spain ends with French victory once Napoleon can redirect resources from the Eastern Front. By 1815, the year Napoleon was historically defeated at Waterloo, he's instead consolidating the largest empire since Rome. The Napoleonic Code spreads across Europe. Feudal systems are abolished. Serfdom ends in occupied territories. Meritocracy replaces aristocratic privilege, but empire requires administration. Napoleon's genius was military, not bureaucratic. As the empire grows, administrative strain increases. Napoleon appoints family members and marshals to govern conquered territories. Many are incompetent. Corruption spreads. Local resistance simmers. Here's where reality intrudes on conquest. Russia is massive, 11 time zones of territory. Governing it from Paris is impossible. Napoleon adopts a strategy similar to British imperial rule: indirect control through compliant local elites. Tsar Alexander I remains as a puppet ruler. French garrisons occupy key cities: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev. Russian resources flow west, but Russian nationalism ignites. The Orthodox Church preaches resistance. Secret societies plot rebellion. In the vastness of Siberia and Central Asia, French authority is nominal at best. Napoleon faces an impossible choice: commit hundreds of thousands of troops to permanent occupation, draining French resources and manpower, or accept limited control and risk losing the territory entirely. He chooses occupation. France becomes an imperial garrison state. The revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, are subordinated to military necessity. Napoleon's empire begins resembling the monarchies he overthrew. By 1830, Napoleonic Europe is institutionalized. A generation has grown up under French domination. The empire seems permanent. The continent is economically integrated under French mercantile policy. Tariffs are standardized. Infrastructure, roads, canals, bridges, connects the empire. The metric system is universal. Legal codes derived from the Napoleonic Code govern from Madrid to Moscow. But Britain's Industrial Revolution accelerates. Shut out of European markets, Britain develops global trade networks with the Americas, India, and the Far East. British industrial capacity eventually exceeds all of continental Europe. Meanwhile, nationalist movements intensify across the empire. Germans resent French cultural domination. Italians demand unification under their own leadership. Poles want independence. Russian partisans wage guerrilla campaigns. Napoleon dies around 1840. He historically died in 1821. But let's assume victory extends his life through reduced stress. His son, Napoleon II, inherits the empire. He lacks his father's military genius and political acumen. The empire begins fragmenting. By the 1850s, the Napoleonic Empire faces insurmountable problems. The garrison state model is economically unsustainable. France is drained by occupation costs. Subject peoples increasingly resist. Russia erupts in full-scale rebellion around 1855. French forces, stretched thin across the empire, can't suppress it. After years of brutal fighting, France abandons Russia except for Poland and western borderlands. Germany unifies not under Prussia, which is too weakened, but through a nationalist revolution that expels French garrisons. Italy follows. By 1870, the empire has contracted back toward France's natural borders. But 70 years of French domination has permanently altered Europe. The concepts of meritocracy, legal equality, and rational administration have taken root. When the empire collapses, successor states don't revert to feudalism. They adopt constitutional governments with elements borrowed from Napoleon's system. Napoleon's conquest of Russia delays, but doesn't prevent European colonial expansion. However, it changes the dynamics. A French-dominated Europe means British colonialism happens faster and more extensively as Britain compensates for lost European influence. France, when it eventually collapses, is too weakened to compete effectively in the colonial scramble. The world wars look completely different. Without Prussian dominance of Germany, German militarism develops differently. Without the particular European alliance system that emerged historically, the triggers for World War I might not exist. However, the fundamental tensions, nationalism, imperialism, industrialization, remain. Great power conflicts are inevitable. They just happen between different actors along different fault lines. Perhaps the major conflict is Franco-German rivalry rather than Anglo-German. Perhaps Russia, having been conquered and humiliated, emerges as a revisionist power seeking revenge. Perhaps an earlier and more violent European civil war occurs in the 1880s instead of the 1914 to 1918 timeframe. Fast forward to today. How does Napoleon's conquest of Russia reshape the present? Europe's borders are radically different. The traumatic memory of French occupation shapes national identities. Germany, unified later and differently, plays a different role in European politics. Russia, having been conquered, develops a deep cultural resentment toward Western Europe that makes our timeline's Cold War look cooperative by comparison. The European Union, built on French-German reconciliation, either doesn't exist or looks completely different. The driving force might be defense against Russian revanchism, rather than preventing Franco-German conflict. America's role in global affairs changes substantially. Without the specific circumstances of the world wars, American emergence as a superpower happens differently or not at all. Perhaps America remains more isolationist, or perhaps it becomes involved in different conflicts that produce different outcomes. The spread of democratic ideals follows a different path. The Napoleonic Code spread Enlightenment principles across Europe through conquest. When the empire collapsed, those principles remained embedded. This might have accelerated democratization in some regions, while creating authoritarian backlash in others. The thought experiment reveals something profound. Military victory doesn't automatically translate to sustainable political success. Napoleon could have conquered Russia militarily. With better timing and Russian mistakes, it was possible. But holding Russia, governing an empire stretching from Spain to Siberia with early 19th century technology, that was always impossible. The Russian campaign's failure wasn't just military defeat, it was the physical limits of empire colliding with strategic overreach. Even if Napoleon had won the battles, he'd have faced the same impossible choice: drain France's resources, occupying Russia, or accept nominal control that would eventually collapse. The real lesson is that even successful conquest doesn't solve the fundamental challenge of governance. You can defeat armies. You can't defeat geography, nationalism, and administrative reality. Napoleon's genius was seeing what was militarily possible and executing it brilliantly. His limitation was not recognizing when military possibility exceeded political sustainability. Conquering Russia was perhaps militarily achievable. Building a lasting empire on that conquest never was. Now I want to hear from you. If Napoleon had conquered Russia and held it for even 20 years, do you think European culture would be better off with widespread adoption of French revolutionary ideals? Or would the authoritarian garrison state needed to hold the empire have corrupted those ideals beyond recognition? And could any empire that large have survived in the 19th century? Or was collapse inevitable regardless of who built it? Drop your analysis in the comments. And if this fictional scenario made you reconsider the relationship between military victory and political success, share it with someone who thinks conquering territory is the same as building an empire, because it never is. And Napoleon's Russian campaign, whether it succeeded or failed, would have proven that.